Looking back on January the 1st, 1991, the Soviet Union was a behemoth of a nation stretching over 8.6 million square miles, 22.4 million square kilometers. That's almost a sixth of all the land on Earth. Imagine that. Inside its borders, more than 290 million people from 100 different nationalities called it home. It wasn't just its size that was impressive. The Soviet Union also boasted a massive stockpile of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons and wielded significant influence across Eastern Europe through alliances like the Warsaw Pact. But here's the twist: within just 1 year, this mighty empire crumbled into history. It's not easy to point to one single reason why such a colossal superpower fell apart. Many factors, both inside the country and beyond its borders, played a part in bringing about the end of the USSR. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed leadership as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, on March 11, 1985, his initial focus was on revitalizing the stagnant Soviet economy and simplifying the cumbersome government bureaucracy. Faced with disappointing results from his early reform efforts, he introduced two pivotal policies: Glasnost, aimed at fostering open dialogue with Soviet society, and Perestroika, which brought quasi-free market reforms to state-controlled industries. However, rather than rejuvenating communist ideology, Glasnost inadvertently led to widespread criticism of the Soviet regime, eroding state control over media and public discourse. Concurrently, Perestroika exposed the contradictions between capitalist market freedoms and entrenched bureaucratic resistance, allowing communist officials to resist reforms not favoring their interests. Ultimately, Gorbachev's reforms and his abandonment of the Brezhnev Doctrine accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Empire. By the close of 1989, Hungary dismantled its border fence with Austria. Solidarity rose to power in Poland, the Baltic states pursued independence, and the Berlin Wall fell. This marked the end of the Iron Curtain era, signaling the imminent dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. In 1990, despite being the world's second largest economy by some measures, the Soviet Union faced chronic shortages of consumer goods and widespread hoarding. The shadow economy, estimated to be more than 10% of the official GDP, thrived due to these deficiencies. Years of economic stagnation had severely crippled the nation, exacerbated further by the Perestroika reforms. Attempts to raise wages through increased money printing fueled inflation, compounding the economic challenges. Fiscal mismanagement left the country susceptible to external shocks, particularly the sharp decline in oil prices. Through the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet Union was a major global producer of energy resources like oil and natural gas, crucial for sustaining its centrally planned economy. However, the collapse in oil prices from $120 per barrel in 1980 to $24 per barrel in March 1986 dealt a severe blow, cutting off a vital source of external revenue. Although oil prices briefly surged after Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, by then the Soviet Union was already in rapid decline, hastening the eventual dissolution. During Ronald Reagan's presidency and emergence of proposals like the Strategic Defense Initiative, it's commonly believed that the Soviet defense spending sharply escalated. However, the reality is that Soviet military expenditures had been steadily increasing since at least the early 70s. Estimating these expenditures was challenging for the Western analysts, with figures ranging from 10 to 20% of GDP. Even with Soviet Union, precise accounting was elusive due to the involvement of multiple government ministries. What is clear is that military spending remained largely unaffected by broader economic conditions. Even during periods of economic downturn, substantial funds continued to flow to the military. Moreover, significant resources and talent were directed towards military research and development, diverting potential innovators and entrepreneurs away from initiatives that could have supported Mikhail Gorbachev's efforts to transition towards a market economy. The prioritization of military investment underscored the Soviet Union's strategic focus on defense capabilities despite the economic challenges it faced internally. In addition, the Soviet Union's involvement in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989 was not only a significant military endeavour, but also a pivotal factor contributing to its eventual dissolution. The Soviet army, revered for its triumphs in World War II and used to suppress dissent during events like the Hungarian Revolution and Prague Spring, found itself entangled in a protracted conflict in a region historically known as the Graveyard of Empires. Despite the formidable reputation, the Soviet military faced unexpected challenges from the Afghan, armed with sophisticated American surface-to-air missiles. Initially, Soviet control over the media limited public dissent regarding the war. However, with the onset of Glasnost, widespread weariness and dissatisfaction with the conflict began to surface openly. This discontent further weakened the military's staunch opposition to Mikhail Gorbachev's reform efforts. The Afghan war not only drained resources and morale, but also eroded the military's influence over policy making. With the Soviet Republic's veterans of the conflict, known as Afghanisti, emerged as vocal critics of Moscow's policy. Many soldiers from Central Asian republics felt closer ethnic and religious ties to Afghans than to Russians, amplifying protests against the war. In the European republics, particularly Ukraine and the Baltic states, opposition to the Afghan war intertwined with broader grievances against Moscow's central authority. Anti-war demonstrations erupted in Ukraine, while Baltic states viewed the conflict as part of a larger pattern on Russia's domination, fueling their movements towards independence. This sentiment culminated in the Baltic states declaring independence in 1990, marking a significant step towards the unraveling of the Soviet Union. On January 31st, 1990, the opening of Moscow's first McDonald's marked a symbolic moment in the waning days of the Soviet Union. The site of the Golden Arches and Pushkin Square was seen as a triumph of Western capitalism, drawing long lines of eager customers, eager for their first taste of a Big Mac. Yet this spectacle was not an isolated event in late Soviet society. Just as enthusiastically, Muscovites lined up for liberal newspapers' morning edition. The era of Glasnost had unleashed a torrent of new ideas, concepts, and experiences, and Soviet citizens eagerly embraced them, whether devouring essays on democratization from prominent thinkers or dipping into the market economy through Western-style fast food. The public certainly hungered for change. Since 1984, the Eduard Shevardnadze bluntly told Gorbachev, "Everything is rotten. It has to be changed." Such sentiments were widespread. Corruption had pervaded Soviet life, and Gorbachev's dual strategy of Glasnost, openness, and Perestroika, resurrecting, aimed not just at economic reform but fundamental transformation of the Soviet ethos. Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's key advisor, recognized the deeper challenge. The main issue today is not only the economy. This is merely the material aspect. The heart of the matter lies in the political system and its relationship with the individual as well. However, as the Soviet public gained newfound empowerment and demanded accountability from a state with a tarnished reputation, tensions escalated. The gap between the expectations of the citizenry and the realities of the Soviet regime became untenable. The final blow came with a desperate coup attempt by hardline communists, which shattered any remaining credibility of the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States constantly hovered on the brink of mutual nuclear annihilation, yet few could have predicted that a civilian nuclear plant incident would contribute to the Soviet Union's downfall. Mikhail Gorbachev had been in power for just over a year when on April 26, 1986, disaster struck. The Unit 4 reactor of the Chernobyl power station in Pripyat, now in Ukraine, exploded. The explosion and subsequent fires released over 400 times the radioactive fallout of the atomic bomb dropped in Hiroshima. The official response to the catastrophe tested Gorbachev's policy of openness, known as Glasnost, and exposed its severe limitations. Communist Party officials swiftly moved to suppress information about the disaster's severity. They even ordered that May Day parades and celebrations proceed in the affected area despite the known radiation risks. Western reports of dangerously high levels of airborne radioactivity were dismissed as rumors, while Soviet officials quietly removed Geiger counters from science classrooms. Workers managed to control the radiation leak by May the 4th, but Gorbachev did not address the public until May 14th, 18 days after the explosion. In his delayed statement, he referred to the Chernobyl incident as a misfortune and condemned Western media for a highly immoral campaign of malicious lies. Decades later, reflecting on the Chernobyl disaster, Gorbachev remarked that it was perhaps an even more significant factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. The incident exposed the vulnerabilities of the Soviet regime and highlighted the profound disconnection between the government and its people. When George H.W. Bush took office in January 1989, he didn't simply continue Ronald Reagan's policies towards Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. Instead, Bush initiated a strategic policy reassessment to craft his approach to dealing with the USSR and issues like arms control. The landscape in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union shifted swiftly. Gorbachev's policy to ease Soviet control over Eastern European countries sparked a democratic wave that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the collapse of the communist regime across the region. Although Bush supported these independence movements, his administration chose a reactive stance, allowing events to progress naturally without compromising Gorbachev's position. With his policy review complete and changes unfolding in Europe, Bush met Gorbachev at the Malta summit. This meeting set the stage for finalizing Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, completing the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, and discussing the rapid transformations of Eastern Europe. Despite international cooperation, Gorbachev's domestic challenges escalated. The Baltic states in the Caucasus demanded independence, and violence erupted in Lithuania and Latvia in January 1991, prompting Soviet military intervention. Bush condemned these actions firmly. By 1991, faced with increasing turmoil in the Soviet Union, the Bush administration reconsidered its policy. Three options emerged: continue supporting Gorbachev to prevent disintegration, shift support to Yeltsin and the republics for a controlled resurrecting or breakup, or provide conditional support to Gorbachev in exchange for accelerated reforms. Bush chose a balanced approach, combining elements of the second and third options. The failed August 1991 coup by hardline communists marked a turning point, diminishing Gorbachev's power and propelling Yeltsin into prominence. In September 1991, Secretary of State James Baker outlined 5 principles guiding US policy towards the new republic: self-determination, recognition of borders, support of democracy and rule of law, preservation of human rights, and adherence to international law. Following the Soviet Union's dissolution, the Bush administration prioritized stability and security from the former Soviet republics. Bush recognized the 12 independent republics and established diplomatic relations focusing on securing nuclear arsenals, curbing ethnic violence, and supporting political and economic translations. Bush and Baker worked closely with Yeltsin and international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF to provide financial assistance, aiming to prevent humanitarian crisis in Russia and ensure the safe transition of nuclear weapons. This period marked a significant shift in global politics, characterized by cooperation and cautious optimism for the newly independent states. In conclusion, the collapse of the Soviet Union can be attributed to a combination of internal reforms, ideological decline, external pressures, economic challenges, and rising nationalism. Gorbachev's policies of Perestroika and Glasnost loosened political and economic controls, revealing governmental weakness and igniting public protests. The aging Politburo's departure from the Marxist ideals and increased opulence alienated the younger generation. Western aggression, particularly under Reagan, strained the Soviet economy further through military competition and economic isolation. The focus of industrialization over consumer goods led to economic shortages and public dissatisfaction. Finally, nationalist movements within the diverse Soviet republics in Eastern Europe eroded the unity of the USSR, culminating in the dissolution in 1991.